Turn to a story that might sound like it's about the recent past, but is actually about the future of democracy in America. We've been covering various ways that a MAGA assault on elections and right-wing fear of losing power are crystallizing in tangible ways right now. Now, there are many reminders of this, and some people would rather move on, but the attacks on our democratic institutions are real. Just today, 2 Georgia election workers targeted by Trump allege they've been facing attacks of harassment, threats, possibly illegal conduct. They are suing a right-wing website for defamation and for contributing to that climate. Across the nation, Trump allies have been trying to put people in key election posts so that they might secure the sloppy coup that failed last time. Then there's ongoing redistricting, which both parties have used, but is particularly acute in several red states, according to the Washington Post. And then, of course, the ongoing wild lies that even though Joe Biden won, which is the fact, there's a lot of talk online and on the right about other things that I'm not going to repeat because this is the news and they're false. Then you have, numerically, the most influential, most watched right-wing voice on television, Tucker Carlson. He's now under fire from his own colleagues, to say nothing of all the fact-checkers, for lying about who carried out the insurrection. I'm not going to go into the lies in depth because, again, this is the news, but he has a whole special report they're pushing that darkly insinuates it was some kind of false flag operation, which it wasn't. But think about this. Tucker Carlson's lie is also a guilty kind of tell. Because even the most hardcore MAGA defenders are finding it is politically and logically easier to blame that criminal insurrection on someone else or insinuate it was someone else rather than defend the MAGA faithful who carried it out. Because it was that bad, because it looks that bad, even with all of the partisanship around it. We are witnessing the mainlining of the 1-6 truthers. Let me repeat that. You may recall the 9/11 truthers who were far more fringe. We now have 1-6 truthers. And they are pushing themselves up the media chain and into the mainstream of the Republican Party. And then consider why this matters beyond just propaganda or one more post-Trump apocalyptic QAnon conspiracy. It's notable because the new lie is cover for a broader lie that tries to justify what is an increasingly minority party's attempt to strong-arm or even steal elections. Now, they can read the writing on the wall in the Republican Party. When you look at the national races, not local, you see it right here. American voters usually back the Democrat for the White House. They've done it in 7 of the last 8 elections across a wide variety of choices, personalities, platforms, ideologies. The fact is, only in 2004 did more Americans actually choose the Republican candidate. In other words, in this recent era over decades, Republicans tend to lose national races when people vote. Now consider this statement about all of this. Quote, there were levels of voting that if you ever agreed to it, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again. Just think about that statement. Republicans can't win when people vote. And that's not someone criticizing, that's not some anti-Republican claim. That was, of course, as you see here, Donald Trump admitting how it works. He understood exactly why the policy, and in his case, what is now under investigation as a criminal plot, the scheme, was to stay in power while losing the election without getting the votes. Now, voter suppression tactics are hardly new across America. Obama campaign veteran and friend of the beat, Chai Komanduri, says, you go back to the founding of the country, of course, it was only white male landowners who were envisioned as voting. Then you had Jim Crow and a lot of other racism. You only had women's suffrage in the modern era. But what we see now is different from just enfranchisement and a debate over that. It is a party that hasn't adjusted to actually winning elections on a regular basis in the national sphere. Komanduri writes that Republicans are convinced they need something akin to those kind of earlier limitations to win elections. Now, there are plenty of times when Republicans do win races, and again, we're talking about the big enchilada, the White House, the power. At the local level, there are Republicans who obviously have fair and square victories, or you had a recent election statewide in Virginia. You have a South that has a lot of Republicans. You just don't have the national support. In fact, Virginia, to be fair, because I always want to show you everything, they had access to the polls that NPR called unprecedented in that race that Republicans won. But now we are seeing the right-wing truther brigade really mesh with elected and leading Republicans. They are embracing the MAGA playbook, which is the Trump playbook, which openly talked about a coup. Take Ted Cruz, who recently got fact-checked while pushing these similar election lies.
Democrats and a lot of the press decided to just engage in incendiary rhetoric rather than acknowledge voter fraud is real. It is a problem.
Well, do you have...
And the allegations of voter fraud needed to be examined on the merits.
Okay, Senator, there is no evidence of fraud that would have really drawn the outcome of the election into doubt. You know that.
He does know that. But just as the lying is a political defense of January 6th, these lies about voter fraud are also a shield for even uglier efforts that may ultimately prove criminal, like that voter suppression or installing people to potentially steal elections. The headlines on your screen are what's happening now for future elections. And it's not because of voter fraud. What do you do about it? Obama campaign veteran Chai Komanduri, who I just quoted, is here when we're back in just 60 seconds. As Republicans try to install new loyalists in the positions that oversee future elections, we have our deep dive conversation tonight. It's a special day here on The Beat. If you've seen the program, you may know it's called simply and logically Chai Day. We believe in truth in advertising, and the truth is Chai is really here. Political strategist Chai Komanduri, a veteran of 3 presidential campaigns, including the Obama campaign. Welcome back, sir.
Good to be back, Ari.
It would be understandable and even easy for people who even slightly follow politics and news over the last few years to say, okay, Chai, there's a lot of lies, and maybe there's more lies on the right. But isn't that an issue of rhetoric? Why do you argue, as I just walked through, that this is about something much more fundamental?
This is really about overturning our democracy and engaging in a program of democratic backsliding that we have seen in many other countries. We've seen this in Turkey. We've seen this in Russia, very obviously. We've seen this in Hungary. We've seen this in Poland. We've seen this in India, etc. And the first thing I think we should say at the outset is that Republicans, contrary to what Trump said, don't actually need to do any of these things to win. In Virginia, Glenn Youngkin won with historic turnout and liberal Democratic voter laws. In Virginia, they don't have a voter ID law. They repeal that. In Virginia, they have election day as a state holiday. In Virginia, they have no excuse. I mean, you don't need an excuse to get an absentee ballot. In Virginia, they have motor voter, so automatic voter registration with a driver's license. Glenn Youngkin still won that. However, Glenn Youngkin isn't good enough for today's GOP. Their goal is to get Trumpists and ultimately Trump himself elected and into power. Glenn Youngkin, even though he played footsie with Trump, I think engaged in some real demagoguery on the CRT issue, but his moderate persona, his Mitt Romney guise, isn't enough for today's GOP. They need to make sure that Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world and Matt Gaetzes of the world can win. And ultimately, they need to make sure that Donald Trump wins in 2024, or if necessary, that they can overturn a lawful election to get him elected. So I think those are some of the things that are really going on. But I also think, very importantly, there is a cultural stream here in the GOP that is worth paying attention to, which is that Republicans are increasingly comfortable with the idea of winning by being a minority. They are comfortable with minority rule. And that goes very deep into our country's history. Obviously, with the Electoral College, the way the Senate is set up, the way the House is set up, you can win with a minority of the popular vote. Obviously, if you can win with a minority of the popular vote, why can't you just win with a minority of the popular vote in, say, Georgia? It's kind of a logical thing. You look at something like Jim Crow, a history of voter suppression that is a big part of our history. And then you also look at the fact that Republicans feel that they are the real America. Even though they're a minority, the white Christian male rural voter is the authentic American. And somebody like Barack Obama is really an imposter. He's a foreigner, which is what Donald Trump, of course, claimed and came to power with. So this is something I think that goes very strong and is very strongly rooted in GOP culture.
Yeah, your deconstruction of that is quite rigorous, and it speaks to some of the legal and structural ways that power has been justified over the course of American history, drawing in part on what is sometimes called critical race theory, to look at what the limits of electoral power were allowed to be, what were considered valid losses, and what in the Reconstruction, the post-14th Amendment, and other examples, Jim Crow, were not. And by the way, Chai, I don't know if you know this, but in the news, critical race theory is not banned. So you may draw on it or criticize it because it's the news. That's a deep-cut political joke that most people, even though I can't hear the audience, Chai, most people are not laughing. That's just my gut sense. But in all seriousness, when you look at that structural analysis, what does that leave for the opposition to do? Because as you know, you worked on so many campaigns, when one side says the other side's being unfair, we have to put our people in, whether that's in the elections, Secretary of State office I just mentioned, or otherwise, the less attuned voter might go, okay, well, it just sounds like another one of those partisan fights, even though you just told us why it's not.
Well, I mean, if you think about the way the critical race theory was used in the election, the reason Glenn Youngkin used it was he wanted to make clear that Terry McAuliffe and the Democrats were linked in the minds of voters with African Americans, that the Democratic Party was the party of African Americans. That was very much the racist dog whistle that he was sending with that issue. And that linkage, I think, was very, very powerful because a lot of Republicans, a lot of voters really feel that that the rights that we should pay attention to are those of white voters. White voters are considered to be the real Americans, the authentic Americans. And you see this kind of in every single country where there's been democratic backsliding. There's this idea of the authentic Polish people, the authentic Hungarian people, et cetera, that is constantly used by demagogues. And what they say is the things that you don't like, those foreign influences, they don't belong. Those people who don't look like you, don't speak like you, do not pray like you, they don't belong. And that's kind of how democratic backsliding gets its start. It gets its start by playing on those sorts of cultural sort of hot button issues. What Democrats have done effectively in the past, what Barack Obama, for example, did very effectively, is he appealed to American patriotism. He said that he represents a new kind of America and a new kind of American in the 21st century. You know, he very much linked himself, for example, with the legacy of Abraham Lincoln. You might remember in 2008, the chants of USA, USA that were constantly a part of Obama rallies, this idea that Barack Obama is showing America the potential of what it is and what it can be. That was very powerful. And I think that that really helped very strongly to push back on this cultural Trumpist narrative that the GOP has always been pushing in one form or another.
I think it's a great point. I mean, viewers will know as you were introduced, you worked with the Obama campaign, so you come from that perspective. But I think you make a fair point, particularly about that appeal, not necessarily to that warmed over nostalgia of Make America Great Again, but still America as a central feature in the appeal of how great it can be. And really, there's a lot of this that is both, as you diagnose, racial, but also looks to the arc of history. And are you looking forward and figuring out how to do it together, or are you trying to restore some earlier period and deal with earlier grievances? And the cycle of that, combined with racism, religious animus, as you say, and other things that we've seen in Europe, is not necessarily something that most civilized people want to replicate. We always think a little extra, so appreciate another Chai Day, sir. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Coming up here, I just was told in my ear we have new details about where Omicron has spread. It is wider than it was when we took over the hour, and we'll explain after.